Hi, welcome to Healing the Gap. I'm your host, Josh, and with me is my co host, Morgan. And with us today, discussing AAPI month, is Ruth Chang from Midstory. Ruth, how are you doing today?
Great to be here.
Good, good. Ruth, if you could just tell us about Midstory, what you do there, just a little bit of background on what you guys do.
Great. Yeah, thanks. So, Midstory is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we do educational media and rely heavily on creative storytelling and solutions-oriented research. And I'm the creative director here. What we're really interested in as well is working with young people and bringing them from all over the country into the Midwest to tell our stories, to be engaged in our issues, and to really invest themselves into the future of the region. And we continue to believe that there is a great need for a nuanced, data-driven, human-centered stories here in the Midwest, and that there are lots in the communities, and that the more we uh, spend time in these stories, in these communities, the more I think our overall nation can uh, progress together, really, through the experience of the mid story through the Midwest.
Perfect. Yeah, actually, kind of going along with one of the articles that stuck out to me was I saw was yeah Asian I think it's like Asian identity in the Midwest. And so I kind of just and since it's AAPI month, I just kind of want to and this for anyone who wants to jump in, um, just kind of like thoughts on the month because this is a this whole kind of episode's gonna be there's a lot to unpack, but I figured we just jump right in. But yeah, just general thoughts on this like idea of an AAPI like awareness month.
Well, I think, to be completely honest, like the term AAPI is something that I've myself come to learn, and I am AAPI, right?
Yeah.
I am Asian American. And I think that's really interesting is sort of watching the evolution of the term Asian American, AAPI, API, NHOPI, all of these terms and what do they really mean? All these acronyms. And I think this term really evolves out of the need to understand that there is a sector of people that is in our community that have very unique experiences and diverse backgrounds. And in some ways, it's almost like maybe it's an acknowledgement that it's difficult to
Yeah.
understand everything that lies therein. And so, I mean, in terms of AAPI Heritage Month, I think it is sort of a distinctly American term, Asian American, right? Being
Right.
Asian. Like, what does it mean to be Asian if you're in
Yeah.
China?
It's yeah, it's such a, actually, yeah, Morgan and I we were discussing this yesterday. Morgan, you want to talk about your we were talking about with your experience with like Hong Kong versus like China, like the
Oh,
differentiation.
yeah. So in high school, I got the opportunity to travel to Hong Kong, and before our trip, we obviously had meetings about culture beforehand. And something that was told us is like Hong Kong, because this trip was in 2014, so like Hong Kong and China are like very different. Like the people within each of those countries, like essentially they like people in Hong Kong don't necessarily see themselves as Chinese, and like us recognizing like there's a lot of political and historical context as to why that is. And it was just like a very like interesting like conversation, and then to go there and see it as well was very fun and cool. But yeah, something like um that's just something like me and Josh talked about. And it also kind of we talked about this idea of um like monolith, and like this idea of being like a pan identity, and when that becomes a good thing, and then like also like when that becomes a bad thing as well. And like I obviously can speak on it from the context of being Black African American, but then you also see that in a bunch of different minority cultures as well, like Pan Africanism, Pan Arabism, Pan Asian, and how there is a lot of positivity and camaraderie. You can get a lot of things done when you have a unified identity, but then how from sometimes from like an outsider perspective looking on a unified identity, there often comes the consequence of viewing people as like a monolith.
Yeah. Be stronger together, but not want to be monolith. Is that something that you feel maybe a struggle is like trying to retain your culture's individualistic identity versus like, but also like, hey, we do get, if we band together, we can maybe get more done, more recognition, more like equality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, my personal my personal experience with that is definitely also a reckoning that's very personal. Growing up in the Midwest, you sort of do everything you can, especially because I was an immigrant at age 9. You do everything you can to sort of very quickly learn English. Uh, and at the time, there was no internet really.
Mm.
There's no YouTube. You don't get to learn. You don't see any other sort of culture. It's
It
just
was
you
dial up.
and right, dial up, and there's barely anything online.
Right.
And you sort of grow up in the Midwest, and you do what you can to, I don't want to say the word assimilate, but yeah, you find your identity. You become another yourself, right? You've become
Mm.
another version of yourself that you wouldn't have been had I that I wouldn't have been had I stayed in Taiwan.
Right.
Uh, and when I went off to college, it was really the first time that I came face to face with, I think, a different set of like quote unquote Asian Americans,
Mm.
who were, East Coasters, and they, uh, you know, maybe had more community than I had. And so their understanding of their identity was different from how I understood my identity, which I think was a very private experience of being Taiwanese, being Chinese American, very familial, in the sense that a lot of the things the values were home. Whereas for them, they felt very free to, like, suddenly, like, 3 of my roommates were Asian, and 2 of them were in like a bunch of the dance organizations
Mm.
on campus. And it was something that I was sort of, I don't think I understood it at the time, but I came to understand that that was their way of celebrating a much wider identity than I was aware of. And it was not an identity that I'm familiar with, which is
Mm.
through like hip hop dancing. It was a very distinctly Asian American like dance group. So I was really like interested in that, and maybe like didn't quite understand it at the time. But that was a way that second generation Asian Americans were finding community, maybe not even necessarily retaining culture, but finding
Mm.
community as
Like
Asian
like
Americans,
forging a
which is,
new one type thing.
yeah, and it's a new one because it's not like necessarily like hip hop or like hip hop dance or even like contemporary dance has anything necessarily to do with traditional Asian culture. But it was a way for them to build that community with
Mm.
other Asians on campus. And so I thought it was really interesting because uh, I think that was very distinct from my experience as an individual and uh, specific to my culture growing up, I think.
Right. At that point, Ruth, did you cling anymore to some of your like Midwest sensibilities? Because like Morgan, we were talking yesterday that when she was at school there, in
Right.
amongst like her groups of people, that she started banding together with people who were also from our area, like the like Midwest. Is he like even across cultures? Is that something, balance, duality of like Asian, but also being Midwestern?
Yeah, when I was 18-year-old going there, there was definitely a culture shock, and Morgan and I just talked about this as well, prior to the conversation. A culture shock, not only, as a Midwesterner, which I think is more foremost for me, as a Midwesterner, going out on the East Coast, I came from a low-income background, immigrant background as well. And so it was like a shock to be out there at Princeton's campus, and it's amazing. The campus is beautiful, and you just come in contact with all the different classes of people that I didn't even know that there were different that exist. So that's one, and on top of that, of course, being an immigrant, which is different from, as I was talking about earlier, Asian Americans, second generation, right? And so that was another sort of uh, I think coming to terms with that was also very, and finding community in that and learning maybe a different language to speak in order to, ally with, and in order to make friends with, and in order to find solidarity. And I think there were definitely a few communities on campus that, were specific to Taiwanese Americans. But I would say that in general, I wasn't necessarily involved in those communities, but was very much like aware and interested in them. I think definitely, like, interestingly, my identity as a Midwesterner sort of took precedent,
Mm.
which is strange, because I think it was one way that we did stood out from others. And so when someone asked me, where are you from? And I would say
You're like,
Ohio.
I'm from Ohio. Yeah. Like, I'm not from I'm from Ohio.
Like,
Yeah,
that's the weirdest state I've ever heard someone say they're from.
right. And so I think that was also fascinating because I would surprise myself in responding that way because I might, like,
Yeah.
I grew up here, yeah, but
Yeah.
I spent 9 years in Taiwan and I was a precocious kid, so when I came here, I spoke, wrote, read and Chinese, right? And
Mm.
so, but I think taking on the Midwestern identity very, very quickly, maybe by necessity, ingrained in me, I think that experience as well when I went out on the East Coast. And, for better or worse, I think it definitely, there is a similarity, I would say, between being a Midwesterner and being an immigrant, because in some ways, like, it's, if you know the history of Midwest, it's all about pioneering, right?
Yeah, right.
And it's all
Going out trying
about,
to find something better, you know.
yeah, and it's about settlement, it's about maybe making do with little. Um, and I think, like, there is some similarities there between
Yeah.
being other and being, like, from the Midwest. So
No, definitely. And I
I guess I
even
never
see
thought
that.
about it that way.
Yeah, and I think like you see that like as the United States was like accumulating more territory, but like even later on through history, like the Midwest, particularly the northern Midwest, is seen as like new territory for other cultures. Like when you think about the African Americans and the Great Migration, once
yeah.
like slavery was abolished in the South and a lot of people migrated north, like Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, like those were the big cities that like a lot of people came to and to this day still have like a really strong like African American hold in them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, in one of the stories, one of the interviewees that we had in contact with for our API Voices project, we also found out that lots of Japanese Americans, at an important time when they were facing, persecution, they came into the Midwest sort of looking similarly for a new start. And so I think that there's an interesting corollary there, for new beginnings and for a place that might be sometimes uh, under the radar or
Mm.
less talked about and less mainstream. And that continues to be the case today.
Like I'm planning a wedding, right? And it's funny because like yeah, most 9 times out of 10, like I wear like my Cleveland heart on my sleeve. Like it will literally too. Like there'll be days that I'm wearing like entire outfits that I'm like I'm wearing like 3 Cleveland shirts on accident. Um, but it's like as I'm planning the wedding, I'm like always trying to remember like I'm like oh like I really want like the music of my culture and trying to remember and hold it place. But then like I always think that like if I went to like I'm half Filipino, half Guyanese. I've been to Guyana. And then like obviously like people from Guyana, like there's like Indo Guyanese and Afro Guyanese, and I'm Indo. Um, and I like to think that like man, if I ever actually went to India though, I'd be the most Ohio born person like you'd ever seen there. But it's like when I'm here, it's always trying to be like I'm like no, like I have this like heritage. I'm very like proud of. I love my family. It's this thing I want
Mhm.
to hold on to. Um and it's always it's a weird dichotomy trying to like blend in but like remember kind of like where you come from type thing.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things, right? Like, it's on your face. Like, you
Yeah.
cannot move it, and people have their thoughts about that. And I think that's sort of the interesting experience that maybe we have is, like, we are very much informed by the place that we grew up in and the people that we're surrounded by and the environment. And at the same time, you still carry all of the things whether you feel it or not
Yeah.
on your face, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of interesting being able to be a person to carry that sort of, it's not a burden, I think, but it's an experience that's very unique. And I think it makes us more sensitive, to the differences that exist in the world. Um, and I think it definitely makes me aware uh, that, yeah, there's more that can lie underneath, and there's lots of complexities. And I would say that, our experiences add a lot to the Midwest narrative. When you tend to think about the Midwest, it's like, oh yeah, it's white bread and it's white farmers. But it's really not. There's a lot of nuances here. There's a lot of stories here that really speak to, I would say, the American dream
Mm.
in the most positive sense of that term. And recently there's lots of the media, I think, attention to Asian American representation on film, TV, and on the big screen, right? And some of that happens in rural areas in the Midwest, right?
Mm.
And so I think that's super interesting. That sort of there's this emergence of this other narrative, which is that of the foreign in one of the most like American places
Mm.
in the US, which we're part of that story.
There's actually like two things I kind of want to unpack from that. One is, so it's funny because like we're talking about the Midwest, but even amongst that, like Morgan and I are both in the Cleveland area, but even then we're on like she's from the east side, I'm from the west,
Mhm.
and you're from Toledo, and even that narrative, I think, is different. And like trying to like I did an interview with you guys, and one of the things I think I remember you guys asking was, where do like the communities from like my heritage like gather, and because like you weren't familiar with like our area, uh and I just think it's kind of interesting the way that like we're in the same state, right? We're
Yeah.
just on different cities, but even still that like that experience varies, even just between like even amongst me and Morgan being on different
Yeah.
sides of town,
Hmm.
Yeah,
like
just like across the river.
yeah.
It's like
Hmm.
drastically different, like the east side versus the west. And like, yeah, I remember like when I went to college in the Northeast, I remember telling people like I wouldn't always say I was from Ohio because I didn't feel like that was like a representative of what I felt like my Midwestern experience was. I would always say I'm from Cleveland,
Right, right.
almost to signify like, no, I'm not like, I'm not on a farm, even though I did live across the street from a lot of cows growing up. Because I lived in Twinsburg for a while. But I was like, oh, like I lived in Cleveland, kind of signify like the culture and
Right,
diversity that
right.
like I was surrounded by. Almost like I felt like I was always trying to like break the narrative of like
Like it's not
that
cornfields. I'm not
yeah,
from
like the
cornfields.
that the Midwest is like super homogenous, but the fact of like, oh, like there's so much like going on, like tons. And like when I COVID ended up canceling, like because of COVID, we had to cancel the trip, but like a trip that I was going to like help lead through like our interfaith organization was like to Michigan to talk about like like the different cultures there, particularly like African American and Arab American cultures within Detroit. And so like we're gonna like take a bunch of like northeastern kids to the Midwest and like show them around. Like it's so much. It's very different than like you think it is. But there was also like some moments of like within like our Black community at school. It was also kind of interesting because the Northeast, like the New York Black kids, had very different experiences from like the California and like the Midwest and the South, and then we all converge on this place, and there's so few of us. um we were There was kind of like always conversations of like our identity and what does it mean to like be Black on this campus, even though we're all from all these different places in the country, where like our racial and ethnic identity is like just thought of like wildly different. And so I think, yeah, people do underestimate like regional differences like
Mm.
within the US and how that like intersects with your other identities, whether you have a community, like a place your community gathers, or if you're like very much like, one of very, very few, and like how that impacts your understanding of like yourself. And then you're around all these other people who think of themselves differently, but everyone else around you thinks of all you as the same. And it's like,
Right.
conflict.
So that actually kind of ties into the other thing I was going to unpack from what Ruth had said was, the representation, especially in like media, that idea of, it's like, yeah, we have all these variations, right? But and that's like, we're getting representation for especially Asian community, but I feel like we're always getting the same type of representation.
Mm-hmm.
I'd argue the same thing with like African Americans too. It's like it's nice, but it's like also there's the narrative feels like it's always kind of roughly the same. That's one of the things I talked about in my interview, and even like Ruth, I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
um kind of had a mutual connection with a feeling like we always see the same like immigrant narrative for Asians,
Mm-hmm.
like with like strict parents, academia being a top priority.
Mm-hmm.
And while, on some cases that's true, and I feel like it's always exactly the same. And it's like I'm happy to see us represented, but
Mm-hmm.
I'd like variation. I want, and even coming back to the Midwest thing, like I'd want just a Midwest like Indian or Filipino guy like story. I just want one out there that's like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, he happens to be those things, but
Mm-hmm.
also he's very much from, or even she or whoever, whatever it is, just like they're also part of where their place is. They're part of whatever their other narrative is outside of just being, the same typical like
Right.
Asian first generation type
Yeah.
thing.
I mean, I think that, you know, so that's the caveat, right? It's like Asian is like Morgan was saying earlier, it's a powerful tool. But also like it could be sort of effacing like the differences and the specificities of all the ethnicities that lie underneath that. And there are, yes. So I mean, I think that is very clear to me, as like a Chinese, like Taiwanese Chinese
Mm.
American, um, growing up, the sensibilities, let's say, of my identity. It's very clear to me. It's not at all sort of like vague or blurry, and it's not um, effaced to me, right? And when I identify myself as Asian, I also don't feel like that identity is blurry to me, but it might be to others, right?
Mm.
And I think that it's up to like in my younger days years, these things like for instance, like I'm not making myself super clear, but um, I was inspired, for instance, by like extremely inspired by an Asian American, who was Chinese American specifically, architect who came out of Athens, Ohio, and her
Oh,
name is Maya Lin. She's famous, of course, for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial
yes,
and
yep.
other things. And we all know her. And she went through sort of like an extremely difficult time in her life, and that's national news, for her entry to that Vietnam Veterans Memorial entry competition. And there was a documentary on that when I was like in sixth or seventh grade. I watched that, and I was just coming out of ESL. You know what I'm saying?
Mm.
Like just finished learning. Just got approved to leave. And I'm watching this in one of my classes, and or like for one of my classes, and I was like so incredibly moved that a young person who looks like me from a place like mine could make it to Yale, could go and pursue a dream that was so like beautiful. And it was about art and architecture, and it was about the humanities. It was about topics like life and death, memories, boundaries. I mean, these things are the things that she was grappling with in her work. And I think that's very much not removed from her
Mm.
ethnic identity at all. So to me, it's like very specific. I consider, like for instance, like the history of China, which I'm tied to, is that of poets, is that of artists, it's that of, scholars and philosophers, and that is an inheritance that we have, that should not be lost under
Mm.
the Asian umbrella.
Right,
You know
right.
what I'm saying? And it's also distinct from the Vietnamese experience. It's also distinct from the Korean experience, which are in some ways tied to China as well, China in history. So as you know, so I think like these things, we like to think like, oh, we're all just Americans. We are, but we are even more because we bring the heritage into it. Like I think I would be very different if I grew up Caucasian in America
Mm,
with Caucasian parents with Caucasian heritage, because European sensibilities are
right.
very different from that of Asian sensibilities or Chinese sensibilities or Thai sensibilities or any other. And I think like I think maybe being aware of that is more our blessing than it is our disability or our disadvantages. Like we should be very much aware that like if your parents or whatever, like they're smart, you shouldn't feel like, oh, like I need to somehow like
Be
be
different.
less because
Yeah.
I'm good at math or something. I'm not saying that just because you're Asian, you're good at math,
Yeah.
obviously. But I'm saying that there is a heritage that helps you, that
Mm,
provides some framework sometimes to enable you to succeed in that matter. And why not take advantage of it?
mm,
Like in the same way that I, as an immigrant at the age of 9, learning English, and from a low income background, made it to Princeton and Harvard. And I'm not afraid to say that. It took hard work, but also a very distinct framework. And I absolutely inherited the history of what it means to be uh, Taiwanese or Chinese or whatever you want to say, the heritage that I have that led me all the way through architecture school and back here to do a nonprofit about uh, a cultural uplift of a region, right? And so all of these things are not separate from my experience as an Asian, as a
mm.
Taiwanese, as a Chinese, as an American, as a Midwesterner. So that's my 2 cents on
Yeah,
that.
that's no, that's a really good point. That's yeah, it all filters into what is you, you know. Um, I kind of do want to shift gears. So, it's something that remind me too is let's talk about food because I thought this was an interesting thing
Yeah,
that we had kind of
yeah.
um it's gonna feel like a weird shift, but thinking
No,
about the those kind of crossover things and even so Morgan and I were talking yesterday. We were talking about like Indian food, right? And that most of the Indian food we actually have here, like from our Indian restaurants, is just like a regional variance. It's a lot come from like the state. I think we talked about it was northern, right, Morgan?
Yeah, I think a lot of the Indian food that we eat in the US is Punjab, I think,
Mm.
or just more northern.
Is there any, well actually yeah here real quick, is there anything from like specific like Taiwanese that you like culinary dishes that you really miss or like this like your absolute
no.
favorite?
Oh, the sense of missing was like all of my childhood. There was no ingredients. And then, like, to be honest, the food culture is so rich in this small island that you don't have to cook if you don't want to, really. And
Mm.
the food is pretty, like, it is what it is. It's not like processed or anything. You can see all the ingredients. And so but growing up, oh, there's so many. I mean, of course, by now this is common for people to know about the Taiwanese food culture. It's not even like a strange thing. Like nobody's gonna say ew,
Yeah.
but like they did, growing up. But growing up, all of the night market foods. I really enjoyed like my oyster pancakes, which are these like omelets, that's made of starch and of course fresh oysters off the coasts, right,
Mm.
of Taiwan. And that's seafood is like you don't see that
Right.
here. So,
Do, do you see anything getting so like the reason I brought the regional variants too is because usually it's the same thing with a lot of other kind of like immigration dishes. Usually there's a lot of stuff that's like you kind of just pick what sells. Do you see anything here that you
yeah.
really feel like
I
something either got
mean,
lost in translation or
oh
like
yeah. I
or
mean,
do you
first
do
of
you think
all,
people are
like,
missing out on like because it
hmm, yeah,
focuses on just like the stuff that feels like that most like other Americans would like eat.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, like Taiwanese cuisine is like a small sample. It's like a sampler of all East Asia food. And so I have a little bit of experience of like everything, including the main dishes from China as well as Japan. because there's a very close tie to Japan as well in Taiwan. But certainly here, and it's no secret that Chinese American food in Chinese restaurants in America is a distinct species of food. It's not like necessarily authentic. And I think it's important to note that food is constantly being evolved in Asia. Like if you go to Taiwan, people are very picky about the food that they eat. And therefore, the vendors are constantly reinventing themselves. And so, yeah, there's like a traditional array of food. But there's also like constant like fad. It's like,
No.
it runs faster than fashion. Every season there's something new on the market. And there needs to be because competition is so high because we're very picky.
Mm.
And the same goes in Korea, the same goes in China and Japan. There's constant like new inventions for what people are trying. And that includes influxes from the West, like the introduction of cheese, for instance, or even like, like corn and all of that. And I mean, that also has like military implications
Mm.
from
Yes.
the
Yeah.
last
Like
century.
leftover surplus things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yep. And like, of course, so to answer the question, like here, one thing is just definitely like Taiwanese specific cuisine is still very much on the minimal because
Mm.
Taiwanese people tend to go back when they come here nowadays. They don't want to be in the US necessarily. Um, the big thing is boba tea, right? Bubble tea,
Mm.
whatever you want to call it. And that's really, I think, the main like association with Taiwan cuisine and regional food experiences here. You have bubble tea everywhere in Asia Town. I know that. And that, you know, I think that's sort of like the sort of capsulization of Taiwanese experience here in the Midwest is just bubble tea and maybe like crispy chicken or something, or
Mm.
like, you know, uh, yeah,
I would say there's no I have yet to see a Guyanese or there may be I think a Trinidadian place which is like the closest I'll get, but there's like no Guyanese service. And the reason too I was bringing up the kind of lost in translation is because so I've um like I know someone who has a food truck that does Filipino cuisine, like does Filipino barbecue, but like again it's generally stuff that's like kind of assimilated over to uh kind of appease more like American tastes. Like, they have like chicken tocino and it like if I had to give a thing that was closest to, it's kind of close to chicken teriyaki. And it's like something that they're like, okay, this sells or it's just like that. But at the same time, like I'm happy he's there. I'm happy he's, doing his thing, thriving, that
right,
getting like our culture out there and
right.
letting people know it's like, hey, like we have like good food that we can share this like with you guys, this now just cultural culinary like piece of our heritage. And it's just like it also just like I wish also that you guys would enjoy all of it, but I'll take what I can get with this like small like sliver of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think like to that point, like for instance, like when you go into a restaurant, like any restaurant, right? And there's a name
Mhm.
that like someone scribbled over like the buffet tray
Yeah.
or whatever, and you're like, oh, that's kung pao chicken, you know? And like you just have to know that what you're tasting is just such a flattening of what
Mhm.
it takes, really, if your mother were to make it with the best ingredients and with the full process and with all of the sesame oil, the whatever, this kind of vinegar, that specific kind of soy sauce, and this amount of sugar, and this type uh, of chicken, right? Processed and marinated in this way. Like if someone took the time to actually make you what that label says, it might not taste the same at all, right? And so I think everything is sort of lost in translation because of that. Because
Mhm.
when you're buying something off the restaurants, it's already going to be a lost in translation process. Yeah. And so, like, as with all these things, I mean, I would never have known that, Josh, that that particular dish is missing this kind of seasoning, you
Right,
know,
right.
because I'm not from there. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
I think America is about a lot of packaging, right? And
Mm,
so we do tend to and eat the package of
yeah.
something rather than the food itself. So,
Familiarity help is like what rules because it's like risk being kind of risk adverse type thing.
but I mean, hey, I know we've talked about this before, but we enjoy our casseroles and we enjoy
Yeah,
our
yeah. Our
American
American
food.
meals, yeah. I you know me, I love McDonald's as much as the next person too. So,
I can't claim Skyline chili though. I'm sorry. Sorry for the
I
listeners.
had it like once. It's okay. I think people make too much of a big deal about it. I only think it's okay. Like I don't like that's another one of those like actual like Ohio representation things where it's like people are like, oh, like you got like I'm like it's okay. Like that's a Cincinnati Columbus like thing. Like I'm from Cleveland. No, not us.
Well, we have Tony Paco's here.
Oh right, yeah, yeah, yeah. I think don't that doesn't it come in a can, right? I think they have like so like they like also
The
sell it
chili
in
dog, you know,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
you're
Like they
going to
also
the
sell like the
restaurant.
chili in a
I
can
hear I
now.
guess we have the restaurant, so might
Oh,
be a can.
okay. Because I
But
think
yeah,
I think I've had the canned
canning and
version.
the history of canning and the Midwest, a whole other
I'll say
Oh
that's
yeah.
a separate
that's a
episode.
whole other episode.
Morgan, is there anything you wanted to touch on?
Something you talked about or that we talked about earlier, like when you said you were at Princeton, how there was like this emerging identity of what it meant for like um to be Asian American on your campus, and like thinking about my own campus, our after like a ton of negotiations and discussions, our school approved a major that was Asian American Studies, because before they just had Asian Studies, and they students really wanted that distinction. And like just from doing some readings and things like that, like oftentimes like the terms like African American or Asian American or those hyphen Americans emerge like in instances of like political negotiations or political wants and needs. And it's kind of it was just really cool to finally see that happen like on our campus of like, oh, like now there's that specific identity is now being like more recognized on this campus, within like an academic and like institutional setting. And like that kind of led back to a conversation that me and Josh had yesterday where I was talking to him about the book by Edward Said, Orientalism, and how like essentially like through like academics and then like it ties into imperialism, how our um ideas of quote unquote the East, and how that's defined is through a very like Western lens of superiority, and how that was using academic fields, and how that translated to essentially justifying imperialism and colonialism. And it's just now kind of interesting to see that kind of like turn back around to now where we have like Asian American studies, like people leading their own studies about their own people, and like the emergence of ethnic studies, and like what that means to like identity minority identities in the United States. And but then also kind of like how you see in like states like Florida and like potentially Ohio, like policies and like laws being brought to like Senate and Congresses within states about trying to like limit that those opportunities, those academic opportunities of ethnic studies in schools.
Yeah, and when you were talking, it sort of, reminds me, as like on the other hand, to the Orientalism, it might be interesting to know for those who, abide by those beliefs, which I think is really archaic, but that, China thinks it's at the middle of and I mean China, like the entity that is historical China, and it's still, anyway, that gets into the politics, but um, yeah, the people, the emperor that exists before, they thought they were at the middle of the earth too, and they thought they were the center. So it really depends on what axis you're revolving around. And I think in recent years, like we talked about film earlier, but certainly in African literature as well, there's just a sense of like we have our own center, like we have our own origin, we have our own genesis, and it's not the one that began right at the point of literature in Europe, right? And so I think that's that's interesting. I think it's a good like thought experiment to sort of like, turn our head a little bit to consider what history looks like for others, and what identity where that begins for others. But I still very much believe in the melting pot, as controversial that is, in the US. And I still very much am like a beneficiary of that in some ways, of the environment that we have here. So I think it's good, and that's why we have these discussions and these conflicts that do still exist. That in some ways I think benefits us, to have, and to continue to have these discussions, and to know that there are differences, and to know that there continues to be gaps, right, per the title of this podcast, like
Yeah.
that that needs to be healed, but also like to know that I think gaps will in some ways always be there, uh and that doesn't always, I mean, the gaps will be there, but that doesn't lessen, like, that distance doesn't lessen the importance of both sides, you know what I'm saying? No, like I think that in some ways, coming like to form a third identity, let's say, in between, like you're not entirely this and you're not entirely that, but you are becoming a third from negotiation is, I think, an important one. And we don't need to like necessarily give a label to it, but um it's something that we value here, at our organization, is that coming to term with the human story when you're face to face with, the nuances and the specificity of the other. You yourself are transformed by that story, and you partake in that story as well.
That was great. Ruth, thank you again for joining us. What do you want as like your big takeaway from this podcast or your culture, AAPI, like big takeaway?
Well, I think from our conversation today, something that I personally, that really stood out to me personally is sort of the emergence of, um, the specificity of our own experience, that is different, is not always a bad thing. And that specificity is something that I think makes us, um, valuable as Americans. And that specificity is something that shouldn't be erased under an umbrella term of AAPI, but it can be accentuated. It can be a platform upon which we share, all of the, I would say, the beauties that do lie in our background. And at this point, my background is somewhere in between, and that's very specific. And I would say, if you look deep into your own experiences, whatever color you are, there are specific experiences that are worth sort of digging into. And it's not just those people who have like a different color, on their skin, right? But also like white Americans, also, have very specific backgrounds that, has lots of richness, that needs to be, that shouldn't just be, sort of blanketed over. And I think that narrative very much, is similar to the narrative that, I'm interested in here at Midstory, which is, enriching the fabric of the Midwest and finding out that there are, textures here, right, that are sort of woven within the communities of the Midwest that needs to be maybe showcased a little bit, that needs to be developed even more. And that overall, that presents, a more complete picture and a more, I think, presents us more direction as we move forward as a community and also as a country. So I think this conversation about AAPI heritage, about what it means to be Asian American, that's what the conversation is about. It's about the national story of us as a community together, how we move forward by exploring the specificity of all the people within it. So that's my biggest takeaway today.
That's perfect. That's amazing. Thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk with us. And I'll have links for Midstory's website as well as our website in the description on this, so you can check out that. You guys have like a bunch of your website's like got a ton of stuff to like look at. It's really great.
And there's
Um,
more coming.
there's
So
more coming.
specific to the
So
AAPI Voices project.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, thank you again. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Catch you guys next time.